Today, I want us to follow with the lesson. So the topic is doing the unthinkable, but I want us to look at it from a different perspective um, than my colleague Dr. Gang has looked at it. I want us to think about the issue of belief. When you talk about suffering, it's usually not a topic that most people are um, conversant with in terms of thinking of the good consequences of it, right? When we think about suffering, we think of how we can mitigate its effects, how we can stop it from happening, and we usually don't think of it in positive terms. Um, but Isaiah does something that is counterintuitive to the human experience. So I want us to look a little bit at a familiar passage, but maybe in a new and hopefully refreshing way. So, if you have your Bibles, please keep them by your side because I will be referencing um, the text a lot. So, when we think about Christianity and you think about suffering, you think about history, and you think about the martyrdom that many have suffered for their faith, it's easy to um, think of Christianity in a completely different way today because you don't typically see, at least in America, real persecution against Christians. And in fact, in America right now, Christianity is seen as being obnoxious, right? That's unfortunate, but that's where we are in our political and cultural and social milieu. Um, I want to share with you a quote that's probably familiar to you, um, but I want us to think about it again in a different way. So, everyone should know who Gandhi is, and if you have any familiarity with anything that he did or thought or taught, maybe this quotation is familiar to you. He said, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Now, the reason why I chose to start out with this is because Gandhi is a man who suffered, right? But at that time, the oppressor of his nation were people who were calling themselves Christians. So the Christians were not suffering; they were actually doing the oppressing. So when he said, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians," it's because the people who were saying they followed Christ were um, really being tyrannical towards the Indian people, all in the name of um, spreading the gospel, right? So Christians and non-Christians sometimes use this quotation to chastise other Christians that were not being like Christ, that were not following in the path that He has set before us. Um, and so people like to use it. However, I want us to think about this in another way that drives us to Isaiah's perennial question. Because Isaiah asks a question in Isaiah 53, verse 1. He says, "Who has believed our report?" In other words, what he's about to tell us is something that's unbelievable almost, or seemingly unbelievable. So, was Gandhi right? Is he right to say that he likes Christ, but he doesn't like Christians? Well, what the question that I thought of, well, what does Gandhi think about Christ, right? If he sees this dichotomy between Christ and Christians, did he see Jesus as Christians see him? Okay. Gandhi followed Advaita Vedanta, which is a Hindu philosophy that refers to the idea that Brahman alone is the ultimate reality. So, what they call ultimate reality is what they call Brahman. It's the phenomenal transient world that's illusory, okay, an illusory appearance of this ultimate reality. So, he doesn't believe the world that we see today is real. And he said the truest self, Atman, is not different from this ultimate reality. So in essence, it's what we today would call pantheism or panentheism. So if he believed that, what is Jesus to him? If he sees this dichotomy, did he see Jesus as Christians see him? And that drove me to another question. What is Jesus to us? How do we see him? If you know anything about Christian history, there were many ideas about what Jesus did, who Jesus was, and what he accomplished on the cross. A lot of people just saw him. It's one idea is called a moral influence theory, that he really didn't die because of sin, but that he just died to show us what a good person would do when they care for other people. So all these ideas throughout the ages have come down about the significance or insignificance of what Jesus has accomplished for humanity on the cross. So, was Jesus a moral philosopher? Was he an itinerant rabbi or something else? So I say the Jesus that many people outside the Christian community, and unfortunately even some inside, what they think of Jesus is nothing more than a moral man, a religious philosopher, or an itinerant rabbi. So he we now know from archaeological evidence that there was a person who walked the earth named Jesus, but what people think about him um, is very different than what the Bible portrays about him. So what difference does it make, right? That's the question. It makes a big difference because our beliefs impact how we live our lives, what we think about our lives, and how we interact with other people who are living on this planet with us. So it has great consequence of what we think about who Jesus is and what Jesus has accomplished. And this is the question of our age too, because we're starting to see a lot of different responses to the problems of the world. And the question is, are those solutions to the problems really dealing with the real problem? Okay. So Isaiah's question, who has believed our report, captures the radical nature of God's plan to reveal himself and his mission to the world. Okay. So what Isaiah is doing is he's talking to the people of Judea, and he's trying to explain to them that what God is about to do is so radical and so counterintuitive that it's thought to be unbelievable, right? God is not about to work in the typical ways that um, people would assume you can accomplish things through. And the reason, one of the reasons why I use Gandhi is because he was a nonviolent he was a proponent of nonviolence, and so is Jesus. And so you see these comparisons often drawn. In fact, Martin Luther King, if you know anything about his philosophical and theological journey, he looked at the comparison between Jesus and Gandhi, and then he eventually wrote his dissertation at Boston University on Paul Tillich. And so he developed his ethos, his pathos for the civil rights movement based on comparing Gandhi and Jesus. But was Jesus just a positive moral influence um, of a nonviolent man, right? Is that what Jesus was? And that's why Isaiah's question becomes so important, because who Jesus is really defies what people think today as of common sense. And I always tell my peers and students, I don't like that word because what we see today is not all that common. And often more than that, it doesn't make much sense what people are saying, thinking, and doing. So Isaiah asks this question. And the Apostle John identifies this conundrum in John. So if you turn your Bibles to John chapter 12, he identifies this conundrum with the problem of belief. Now, I want to bring to your attention or to your remembrance, he's not talking to secular people, and neither was Isaiah. They're not talking to secular people. They're talking to religious people who already have a vested interest in religious things. But that's not enough. It's not just enough to be invested in religious ideas or um, religious mantras or perspectives. There has to be an accounting with a person, right? It's not just a religious belief, right? God's going to work through a person, and how we relate to that person makes all the difference. So in John chapter 12, when Jesus was getting his disciples ready for his soon ascension on the cross, in verse 32, he says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." And then he said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So the crowd answered him, "We have heard from the law that the Christ or the Messiah remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up?" Who is this Son of Man? Right? So their ideology about who the Son of Man is that he's supposed to live eternal. The Hebrew Bible does say that, or what people call the Old Testament. It does say that the Messiah's reign will be forever, right? It says it in Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 9. The problem is they stopped reading. If you kept reading, you would eventually run into Isaiah chapter 50 through 53. And so Jesus said to them in verse 35, "The light is among you for a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. The one who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light that you may become sons of light." When Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. Now that's the key, okay? They said in John earlier, "Show us a sign." And John says, even though he did the signs, they still didn't believe in him. In other words, their belief was still ideological. It still was just an idea about what life should be like. But when the person who is actually supposed to bring about a transformation of life was right in front of them, they wouldn't believe. And so in verse 38, John writes, "So that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, Lord, who has believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" This is a direct quote from Isaiah 53. And then he continues utilizing another quote from Isaiah chapter 6. So this is the perennial problem. It's not just religion, it's not just ideology. It's who's going to believe that the Son of Man must be lifted up to draw all people to himself. So now we're moving beyond just an itinerant rabbi, we're moving beyond just a moral philosopher. We're moving into the realm of one person suffering for all humanity. And John quotes from Isaiah saying, it's just seemingly unbelievable. It's not something that we think of in terms of transforming the world. And even in First Corinthians chapter 1, Paul said, "To those who are perishing, the cross is foolishness. To the Greeks, it's foolishness, and to the Jews, it's a stumbling block." Why would he say that? Because in Deuteronomy 21, it says, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." So any Jewish person hearing that this Messiah figure is going to hang on a tree, they would see him as accursed, right? And to the Greeks, um, they had a notion of crucifixion as well, where they said it's better to be um, a woman. I didn't say this. This is what they said. Than to be hung on a tree. It's better to suffer the torments of Hades than to be hung on a tree. So, and then Paul says, "But the wisdom of God is shown through the cross." So it's easy for us today to just say it as a mantra that Jesus died for our sins. But when you really think about, well, how does that accomplish everything that God said is supposed to happen? If you have a ideology or a worldview already in place, and then you're confronted with this reality that the cross somehow is showing us the wisdom of God, that someone's suffering is somehow bringing about your joy and your happiness, it seems counterintuitive even in today's world. If you told someone that you had to suffer for them to be happy, I'm almost 100% positive most people would revile against that notion. Why should one person have to suffer for someone else to experience true joy and true freedom? And so that's the conundrum and the question: who has believed our report? It's not so easy um, as we make it seem sometimes. And yet belief persists. What was so unbelievable, right? I say hopelessness is ironically part of the Christian's condition. Isaiah 51 tells us it's because of sin that we experience hardship, right? We go through these times of despair, these times of hardship, and he's saying it's because of the condition of sin, right? So how do people respond? Right? Some people choose optimism, some people choose moralism, some people think high culture or other types of methods can address the consequences of sin, right? So a lot of people don't acknowledge that sin is a real thing, but it's obvious we see the consequences of sin all around us. How do you ameliorate the problem? People use these methodologies. The problem is it doesn't solve the internal epidemic of sin, right? If you are an optimistic person, it doesn't change the fact that human suffering is happening around you. If you are a moral person, that doesn't ensure that your neighbor is going to be moral. If you do believe in high culture, however you understand that term, right, it doesn't mean that other people won't engage in what you would consider low culture. So while people are trying to use these methodologies to deal with the consequences, they're not acknowledging what is the real problem. And I keep hearing people, by the way, this is just an excursor. In the political discussion in America, I keep hearing this discussion that if the body politic is just more educated, then they would see things my way, right? They would see that my civic orientation is a more fruitful and better way to go. Is it just an issue of education? Is questioning someone's intelligence solving the problem, right? So I'm listening to all these discussions, to all these um, assertions about how to deal with the problems of the world, and they all lack a significant and robust picture of what the real problem is. They keep dealing with the consequences. And so we come to Isaiah. What makes the suffering of the servant so unbelievable is the misdiagnosis of the universal disease. In other words, if you listen to just the problems that people are talking about, it typically is just more localized. Okay. It's so how do you solve the problems of the world? Well, people who live in America will think, well, American politics. Well, what about people who live in Iraq, Iran, people who live in Australia, people who live in the countries in Africa? Does our political system fix their problems? No. And they have a different political system than we do. So now what you're saying is your political system or your cultural ideology, you're admitting that it doesn't solve the universal problem. It can only maybe ameliorate some of the consequences of sin where you live, right? But sin is a universal problem, okay? So now the belief that Isaiah is asking us about, who believes this report, is that God somehow has to deal with a universal problem. So apparently, the problem seems so insurmountable that humanity has mastered what I call mantras of short term panacea. And these problems Isaiah identified, and they're still with us today. He chastised Judah for trusting in the political apparatus. He chastised Judah for trusting in ritual. Okay. They were still doing the rituals while they were sinning and taking advantage of their neighbors and oppressing them. He chastises Judah because they engage in idolatry. And he chastises Judah because they make these alliances with other nations. And it wasn't just political, it was also religious. It also was cultural. It also was social. And there's many other things I can mention, but I just want to get you a sense. The things that we're trying to do today are no different than the ways that Judah was trying to assuage their guilt, right? How they were trying to just deal with the consequences and not really deal with the center of the problem. So, to an unbelieving heart, these methodologies seem more practical than suffering. I mean, if you ask a person if you have suffering on one hand or politics on another hand to solve the problems in the world, which one would most people choose? I think most people would choose politics, right? And yet, God's methods make man's work of no effect. And this is where Isaiah has been pushing us in this section of Isaiah, that human attempts to deal with the central problem of sin are always going to fall short. And I'm not here advocating that we do nothing. No, I believe we should be civically engaged and we should be doing things to try to help others. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about the real problem. Okay, you can't put a band-aid on a laceration and expect it not to get infected if you don't take care of it. So the crisis and the solution. So turn with me to Isaiah 51, because Isaiah is going to start making it clear how God is going to solve the problem, but it's going to be full of surprises. So in Isaiah 51, verse 6, listen to what he says. He says, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth beneath. For the heavens vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and they who dwell in it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will never be dismayed. So God evokes what can be called planetary dystrophy. In other words, everything that you see as stable is going to atrophy or lose its strength, lose its power. It's going to be ineffective in dealing with its problem. But he says, but his salvation and his righteousness is everlasting. So he continues unveiling his everlasting work of salvation. So then Isaiah introduces this key phrase called the arm of the Lord. Now, if you have been reading Isaiah all the way through, the association of the arm of the Lord has been with might and with power. So now we think, yes, God is going to defeat and destroy our enemies so then we can go on living our lives. But again, the problem is sin. It's not just political, it's not religious, it's not economic, it's not cultural. The problem is sin. So while Isaiah is setting people up to think the arm of the Lord is going to be somehow his political or the enforcement of his power on other people, it carries the weight of the world. In Isaiah 9:10, he points to the Exodus. God unveiled his arm in the Exodus. God unveiled his arm in creation as evidence of his mighty power. So again, you have to imagine, if you're hearing this for the first time, you think that God is going to solve the world's problems through power, the way that we think about power. But then Isaiah makes a remarkable statement. He calls Jerusalem, which is described earlier as a corrupt city, he calls it a holy city. So now we think of the arm of the Lord and holiness. What do those two things have to do with one another? How can this be? Israel is sin sick, filled with idols and justice. Isaiah said Israel is like Sodom, and they're seemingly addicted to rebellion against God. So how is the arm of the Lord, which we associate with power, going to turn this corrupted people into a holy people? So now you see the problem. It can't just be political. It can't just be cultural. It can't just be social. It can't just be judicial or any other human methodology, because those things can't transform the human heart. God himself, he says, he is going to comfort and redeem his people. So he's not going to leave it to any human mode or any human method. He is going to comfort his people. He is going to redeem his people. He says he will bear his arm. And I want us to read Isaiah 52, because we're getting closer to how the arm of the Lord is going to be um, bared. So in Isaiah 52, I'll start actually at verse 9. He says, break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before all the eyes, before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Remember, the problem is sin, so the problem is universal. And now God tells us he's going to bear his arm on a universal scale that's going to take broken people like you and I and make us holy. So we are all of a sudden brought into a completely different scope of things. We're brought into the realm of sacrifice. Now, remember, up to this point, God has just been talking about his power. But in verse 11, he says, depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. So now you have to understand questions are starting to arise in the people's minds. Wait, I thought we were talking about the arm of the Lord. Okay. So now we come to Isaiah 52, verse 13. So, first, the servant who is going to do this work for God. So, in the servant songs in Isaiah have been describing the Messiah figure as someone who's going to rule over mankind with justice and righteousness. You can read that in Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 50. Now, here we're introduced to the fourth servant song of the book of Isaiah. So, first, he identifies the servant with God, and this is the first surprise. He says, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. Now, if you read the book of Isaiah, and I encourage you to do it in one sitting, this phrase or this phraseology is only used of God in the book. Remember in Isaiah 6, verse 1, he said, and I saw the Lord high and lifted up. So only it's a surprise. Wait a minute, this servant who's going to suffer is identified with God. So we now know this is not just political, it's not cultural, it's not in any other way that we assume that God is going to work. Okay, this servant who's going to suffer is identified with God, but then he's identified with us. Okay, verse 14, as many were astonished at you, okay, his appearance also is so marred beyond human semblance and is formed beyond that of the children of mankind. So the exiled people are suffering, and just as the exiles were marred from oppression, so too our servant would experience suffering. So this servant identifies himself with God because his work is universal, but then he identifies himself with humanity so he can understand, like Paul said in Hebrews 2, the feeling of our infirmities. Okay, so no human mechanism or mode can accomplish this. There is no political system that is representative of God. I know people in America like to say it, but it's just not true, right? So the only thing that can help us is at once identify with God and at the same time identify with us. And what makes this all the more unbelievable is the willingness of this servant to accept the ignominy. Okay. Paul said, scarcely would a righteous person, or scarcely would a person suffer for a righteous person, but Christ, while we were in our sins, suffered for us. And he did it willingly. I don't know any political leader that's willing to suffer. I know a lot that are willing to prosper, right, from their constituents, but how many of them are willing to suffer? And so Isaiah is introduced what's unbelievable. How can someone who is identified with God also be identified with mankind and suffer willingly in a way that's unfair to him? Okay. And then he tells us that Jesus, or the Messiah, the suffering servant, was stricken, smitten, and bitten. So I actually want us to read the text together. That's I'm all PowerPointed out at this point in life. But I want us to read Isaiah 53 together because I think sometimes we forget it's not just a prophecy about someone dying for another person, but it's who is causing the death to happen. So Isaiah says, "Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Again, he now brings us to understand, what does the arm of the Lord have to do with making us holy? And then he introduces the servant. He grew up before us, okay, like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. It doesn't have the nourishment and the sustenance that we would typically expect. Okay. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. Again, now this is ironic because he has been identified with God in Isaiah 6:1. And we see God in um, his regal garb. We see him in this beauty and majesty. And he says, no, this being that's identified with God and man, there's nothing about him. I love what Ellen White says in Desire of Ages. She says, Jesus had a pensive face. You could almost walk in a room and not even notice that he was there. So it's not going to be the typical things that we aspire to or think of when we think about power and might and deliverance and salvation. It's nothing about him other than what he does and who he is for us. It says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And then comes something that we typically don't really get as Christians. It says, as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. We didn't think that what he is desirable. We don't look at him as someone who should be lauded and praised. And when Jesus walked the earth, we see the radical disrespect of him, right? They called him a bastard, right? His own family called him crazy. Go back and read Luke 4. They called him crazy. They came to the house, same thing in Mark. They came to the house and said, he is out of his mind, right? It says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten, and I call it bitten, but it really says afflicted, okay, by God. And this is the part that is unbelievable. That it's not just Jesus giving his life for us, it's that God has to do this to sin, and that Jesus willingly stepped in the path of God's wrath against sin. God talked about the cup of wrath in chapter 51 and 52. He steps in front of that arrow that brings God's wrath. He drinks that cup of God's chastisement. And then he says, it's because of that, because he was pierced for our transgressions, because he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And I'm going to close with this. Two things. When it says our transgressions, in Israel's ritual system, there is no sacrifice for that. Okay, if you read in Leviticus chapter 20 or Numbers 19, the person who did this sin, they're supposed to automatically be cut off. There's only one person who can forgive this kind of rebellion, and that's God. In Exodus 34, verse 6 and 7, Numbers 18, Daniel 9, only God is the one who is able to forgive this kind of sin. And so again, it's this servant figure. If he's suffering for this kind of sin that you and I have committed, this kind of rebellion against God, he's God, because only God is able to take care of this sin for us. So that's why I say the approaches of the world to deal with its problems can never satisfy the problem of God's justice against sin. And the second thing is, what is the outcome? The outcome is, because of time, I'll just read verse 11. It says, out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, and Jesus is now exalted. So it's through his suffering that he is exalted. This is counterintuitive to humanity. Most people don't want to suffer, most people do want to be exalted. But Jesus is the one who took every sin that you and I have ever committed upon himself. Every sin of any other person in this world has ever committed, even the person we think is vile and corrupt and debased, he bore their sin. And when you think about that, that is amazing grace. And that's why Isaiah said, Lord, who has believed this report? And so I'll close there.